this is the Bible study topic that Joe was curious about. Joe was reading the book of the prophet Isaiah, and Jerusalem figures into Isaiah pretty prominently. And we'll kind of dig into the details of why that is here in a little bit, but basically, Jerusalem as the capital city is what will be under threat. Isaiah, like Jeremiah, is prophesying the destruction of Israel and the destruction of Jerusalem because of people's unfaithfulness. And between all the readings about Jerusalem and Isaiah and all the stuff about Jerusalem that we covered in Revelations, where there's a new Jerusalem, this is what Joe was curious about. Was just kind of taking the long view of Jerusalem itself as a topic in the Bible. So that's what I prepared for us tonight. So just by way of introduction, Jerusalem is the historic capital of the ancient kingdom of Israel and the ancient kingdom of Judah. There was Israel and Judah are not always two countries. They are united under King David and King Solomon, and then they will split after Solomon's death. Jerusalem is the capital of the United Kingdom when it is united, and of the southern kingdom of Judah once they separate. In Hebrew, the word Jerusalem literally means city of peace. You will frequently find Jerusalem referred to as Zion or Mount Zion in the Bible because it's built. That's the name of the city on which Jerusalem. That's the name of the hill upon which the city of Jerusalem was built. So that's also where we get the Zionist movement to reclaim the city of Jerusalem in the modern era. And you will find Jerusalem, Zion, and Mount Zion are used fairly interchangeably in the Bible, especially in the Older Testament, especially in the writings of the prophets. They'll refer to Jerusalem as Zion. Just by way of sort of getting a sense of how deep the historical significance of this city goes. So the city proper, the walled city in which the kings of Israel and Judah lived, was built on Mount Zion. But just on the other side, a little river valley, on Mount Moriah, is where the actual temple was built. The temple was on the far eastern side of the city of Jerusalem, on the other side of this little riverbed, this little river valley. And Mount Moriah is where Abraham took Isaac to be sacrificed. In that story from the Old Testament, you all know this story?
Yeah.
So just to give you some sense of how deep the historical significance of this site is in the Bible, at the time that Abraham is taking Isaac to be sacrificed, we don't have a city of Jerusalem yet, but this site, that place where the temple would later be built, is already being mentioned in the Bible. One of the reasons why I think that Joe wanted to study this topic is because Jerusalem is not just used to talk about the historic city and the site in which so many things took place in the Old and New Testament, but that Jerusalem is also used symbolically in the Bible. And so we are going to cover that in more detail later, but insofar as we talked about, oh hey, there's Joe. I was worried you weren't going to make it to the study that you requested.
All of a sudden you look at the clock and usually, okay.
So just to catch you up, most of this stuff is not going to be shocking or surprising to you, and you can just read the first 3 bullet points and you get caught up. But the thing is, what's that?
The Care Bears activity?
That is more in case you get bored, I guess. say though, before we got started, was that we will not be having Bible study on the first Tuesday in March. That's Charlotte Stever's birthday, the wife of Carrie Stever, the camp director of Placerville, so I'm going to be attending that. I shouldn't say there will be no Bible study. Would one of you like to lead a Bible study on the first Tuesday in March? We all think about that. I maybe spoke for you all. I will not be here on the first Tuesday in March, and if it is dependent on my being here that we have Bible study, then we won't have a Bible study. But if it's not dependent on my being here, then one of you all can put something together. But anyway, yeah, so that's, and then you can just kind of get caught up there with those first 3 bullet points. And we were just talking about how Jerusalem, 4th bullet point, in the Bible does not just refer to the city itself, but is used symbolically. And sort of like how we talked in Revelations, when we did our Revelation study, about how there's sort of a earthly reality and a heavenly reality, and those two mirror each other. That's part of the reason why Jerusalem is used symbolically in some cases, because it's just like Jerusalem is the capital city of the nation of Israel, God's chosen people. Jerusalem symbolically can be used to refer to sort of the capital city of God's kingdom. The kingdom of God in which God's will is done. So like when we encounter Jerusalem, the new Jerusalem coming down from heaven in Revelations, for instance, it's sort of the capital city for God's kingdom, from which God will rule. Last thing that I did want to say before we jump into this. This is by no means an exhaustive study on Jerusalem as it occurs in the Bible. The word Jerusalem appears 808 times in the Bible. And that doesn't even include the times where the word Zion or Mount Zion or the city of David, etc. is used in place of Jerusalem, right? Just the word Jerusalem shows up 808 times in the Bible. We obviously do not have time in a single evening, or even, if we're doing this month, twice a month, it would take us longer than the book of Revelations in its entirety was going to take us to cover every single time that Jerusalem pops up in the Bible. So this is just a sort of big picture overview of the historical and symbolic significance of the city. And one of the things that I think is important to keep in mind, that maybe is significant enough that I should have given it a bullet point, is the history and the symbolism are not so neatly delineated. Does that make sense? Like Jerusalem as a historic city and the real history of Jerusalem is part of its symbolism as well. Because when you think about like Valley Forge, right? Like or Gettysburg, right? Like these are historical places where historical events happened in this country, but there's sort of a mythology that develops out of that, a special significance to us, right?
C.S. Lewis is true myth.
Right. In the same sense, right, much of the significance that is spiritual, that is symbolic, is directly tied to real, actual historic events in this real, actual historic city. There's, when we look at like Revelations and the new heaven and the new earth, this is strictly symbolic, but a lot of the significance of Jerusalem in the Bible comes directly from its history. So that's sort of the introductory remarks about Jerusalem before we really get going. Any questions or comments or anything? All right. So we are going. Another possible name for the The city of Jerusalem is Jebus, but we'll get to that right now. Jerusalem is not originally built by the Jewish people. This is not a city that was constructed by the people of Israel, by the Jewish people. It is originally a city built by the Jebusites. And we're going to read about it in Joshua 10. So just by way of background, when we get to Joshua, right? Joshua is the successor to Moses. Moses is the person who has led the people, Israel, out of Egypt, out of captivity to Pharaoh, right? We got the 10 plagues, we got the parting of the Red Sea. We have to wander in the wilderness for a lot of years because the people of Israel, as soon as God rescued them, immediately got naughty. And God said, you know, since you are all being naughty and worshiping your golden calves and rejecting me, like not 10 seconds out the door. The punishment is that the adults that were alive at that time had to wander in the wilderness until they all died, and basically a new generation was what would be led into the promised land. Joshua is the guy who takes over for Moses. So when Moses dies, we're right on the edge of the Jordan, about to cross over into the promised land. That's where Joshua picks up, is we have crossed into the promised land. We have conquered Jericho at this point. They're starting to conquer. And we are going to read Joshua 10, 1 through 15. So that's your background, right? Moses is dead, Joshua's the new leader, they've crossed the Jordan, they're in the promised land, they're starting to conquer. When King Adonizedek of Jerusalem heard how Joshua had taken Ai and had utterly destroyed it, doing to Ai as the king had done to Jericho and its king, and how the inhabitants of Gibeon had made peace with Israel and were among them, he became greatly frightened, because Gibeon was a large city, like one of the royal cities, and was larger than Ai, and all its men were warriors. So King Adonizedek of Jerusalem sent a message to King Hoham of Hebron, and King Piram of Jarmuth, and King Japhia of Lachish, and King Debir of Eglon, saying, "Come up and help me, and let us attack Gibeon, for it has made peace with Joshua and with the Israelites." That's a fun story, by the way, the story of Gibeon tricking their way into peace. You can flip a couple chapters back if you want to read that. Then the 5 kings of the Amorites, the king of Jerusalem, the king of Hebron, the king of Jarmuth, the king of Lachish, the king of Eglon, gathered their forces and went up with all their armies and camped against Gibeon and made war against it. And the Gibeonites sent to Joshua at the camp in Gilgal, saying, "Do not abandon your servants. Come to us quickly and save us, and help us, for all the kings of the Amorites who live in the hill country are gathered against us." So Joshua went up from Gilgal, he and all the fighting force with him, all the mighty warriors. The Lord said to Joshua, "Do not fear them, for I have handed them over to you. Not one of them shall stand before you." So Joshua came upon them suddenly, having marched up all night from Gilgal. And the Lord threw them into a panic before Israel, who inflicted a great slaughter on them at Gibeon, chased them by the way of Beth Horon, and struck them down as far as Azekah and Makkedah. As they fled before Israel, while they were going down the slope of Beth Horon, the Lord threw down huge stones from heaven on them as far as Azekah, and they died. So they got hail. There's a little Revelations 2.0, right? Or I guess prequel to Revelations. They get some hailstones. And there were more who died because of the hailstones than the Israelites killed with the sword. On the day when the Lord gave the Amorites over to the Israelites, Joshua spoke to the Lord. And he said in the sight of Israel, "Sun, stand at Gibeon, and moon in the valley of Ajalon." And the sun stood still, and the moon stopped, until the nation took vengeance on their enemies. Is this not written in the book of Jashar? The sun stopped in mid-heaven and did not hurry to set for about a whole day. There has been no day like it before or since, when the Lord heeded a human voice, for the Lord fought for Israel. Then Joshua returned, and all Israel with him, to the camp at Gilgal. Okay, so this is our first record of Jerusalem showing up. We talked a little bit about how Mount Moriah has the significance, but at the time that Abraham goes to sacrifice there is not a city. But now that we've gone through Abraham to Isaac, Isaac to Jacob, Jacob to Joseph and all his 12 sons, spent all that time in Egypt, plentiful, multiplied, left Egypt, 40 years in the wilderness, come back. It is here in Joshua 10 when the people are returning to this land that Abraham and his descendants had originally come from, that by this point there is a city named Jerusalem. It is an Amorite city, home to the Jebusites, and these folks kind of band together in order to stop the encroachment of Israel. They're worried that Joshua has already taken over 2 cities. He's conquered Jericho and Ai, and he has gotten the Gibeonites to be his allies and servants, basically. The Gibeonites in this, they trick the Israelites into peace in this really fun story where they show up, they grab the oldest clothes they can round up and the oldest wineskins and the most worn down animals and walk to the Israelites, and they're like, "We are very distant people from far off and have traveled to this land to pay homage to you and your God, for we've heard of what your God has done in Egypt. Will you make peace with us?" And the people of Israel are like, "Yeah, we'll make peace with you," because they think the Gibeonites are from some very far off land. And then weeks later, they figure out that the Gibeonites are actually their neighbors, the next plane over. And they're like, "Hey, what gives? You told us you were visitors from this distant land." And they're like, "Well, we were totally scared after you conquered Jericho and Ai, and we didn't want you to conquer us." But at this point, they had sworn an oath of peace to God, so they couldn't break it. So they're like, "All right, Trixie, you get peace, but you have to be our servants." And they're all good with that. So, so they've made peace. Yeah, it's a fun story. But anyway, so that's our first appearance. And we read in Joshua 15:63, just real quick little. So Jerusalem will pop up once or twice more in between, but in Joshua 15:63, we are told, "But the people of Judah could not drive out the Jebusites, the inhabitants of Jerusalem. So the Jebusites live with the people of Judah in Jerusalem to this day." So in the process of conquering the promised land, Jerusalem for a time is going to stay in the hands of the Jebusites for a while. It's also maybe worth taking a moment, not too long, so I want to get through this thing, but Joshua is a messy book to read. I just make the assumption that some of you might at some point want to read more of some of these things that I just kind of pluck out for our Bible studies. And if you go and read Joshua, here's the deal. Joshua and all the people of Israel just show up in the promised land and just start killing everybody who's already there and taking all their land. And I mean killing everybody. Full-on genocide, no survivors type of killing everybody. One of the things that we're going to talk about in a little bit, this is probably worth noting. I don't know how to say this. There's actually this really great essay that I came across that says the Bible was not written for you. That's the title of the essay. And the point of the essay is that it's important to keep in mind that the perspective of the biblical writers is one of general powerlessness, right? The folks who write the Old Testament do the bulk of their writing The Old Testament, as we have it today, really takes shape in the period immediately following the destruction of the temple and of Jerusalem by Babylon, in captivity, in exile, and then the return. So the majority of what we have in our Older Testament today is written by a people who just got done getting conquered. In the same way, the stories that we find in the New Testament, right? The New Testament is written by people who are a pretty small fringe group of what is already a relatively small religious movement within the massive Roman Empire. So one of the things that I think is important to point out is that probably a lot of these stories are exaggerated, and a lot of these stories are exaggerated by a people who have known exactly this kind of conquest as a way to make themselves feel better, feel more powerful. I guess all of this is to say, please don't read the book of Joshua and get the idea that God wants us to go out and conquer some lands and kill all the people. And there's actually a really interesting discussion of this way that Israel wages total warfare and just kills everybody. As Walter Brueggemann also talks about this as this is war not for material gain, whereas everybody else would have taken these people as slaves, the Israelites don't. Whereas everybody else would have added the treasury to the pockets of the people, the treasury is added to the temple. Any gold or silver or precious stuff is given over in the name of God and becomes part of the tabernacle, part of that treasury. The animals and livestock are even killed. And a part of it, Brueggemann actually makes an argument that maybe this is, at the very least, what you could say about the people of Jerusalem is that they are not conquering in order to line their pockets. But it's still pretty brutal and pretty difficult stuff to read. It is.
So then this was, 63 is basically addressing what's put down in writing by the people just coming back from the diaspora.
It is difficult, if not impossible, to parse out exactly what is written when. And a lot of stuff is written earlier, but then edited after the diaspora to elevate or highlight certain things or not. For instance, one of the things that we'll talk about here in a little bit is that circumcision was probably not nearly as big a deal as it was pre-Babylonian and post-Babylon, like the Babylonian conquest.
But it's also interesting to note is that all of this was verbal.
Right. Well, and so much of this, you even get references to what the book of Jashar that we, back in the last reading, is not this written in the book of Jashar? Like the story where Joshua and his army came and beat the 5 kings and made the sun stand still so he had extra time to kill more people. There's books of the Bible that we don't even have anymore that the Bible itself references, right? We don't have a copy of the book of Jashar. When it says, is not this all written down in the book of Jashar? I guess it is. We don't have a copy of it anymore. It didn't survive to this point in history. But at some point it was, right? Like I said, it's just yucky. Reading the book of Joshua is not a fun read for me. So, Jerusalem, the point of this, is not a city that is originally built by the Jewish people. It exists in the Promised Land. It was a city of Jebusites. They hold on to it for a while. It will pop up a few times, but in 2 Samuel 5, 6 through 10.
What I wanted to ask about 63, I just,
Oh,
so these people live with the people of Judah in Jerusalem to this day. This day was not this day.
right. It's not clear to what, I'm not sure when it's.
This day.
I mean, I think what we're gonna find, I think that's probably around the time of 2 Samuel 5, 6 through
But you
10.
couldn't take this, I mean, you shouldn't take this literally and say, these people are still in Jerusalem.
Right, right. Well, I mean,
They could be, but David took.
and yeah, ancestry in the Middle East is,
Yeah.
you know, so one of the things that's important to be aware of is the Middle East, it's much more tribal. So like when we are talking about these 5 kings, don't have an idea of like Babylon type scale. Like king in this case means like the ruler of this decent sized city with some walls around it, and all of the like shepherds and farmers who lived or in the immediate area around it, right? That's why we have Jebusites who are themselves Amorites, right? Like there are 5 Amorite kings, and they are, you know, the Amorites is like a bigger ethnicity. Jebusites is more like a tribe. So I'm sure you go back far enough and there's some genetic mixing between different folks. But yeah, but yes, to this day doesn't mean
To this day.
to this day. Yeah, no, in fact, we're going to read right now 2 Samuel 5. 6 through 10. This is where we find the king and his men marched to Jerusalem against the Jebusites, the inhabitants of the land. So Jebusites are still there as of the time of King David. Right? So this is much later now. We've gone through Joshua, then we've gone through the time of Judges, then we've gone through the time of Saul. Now we're finally to King David, and we still got some Jebusites there. Marched to Jerusalem against the Jebusites, the inhabitants of the land, who said to David, "You will not come in here, even the blind and the lame will turn you back." Thinking David could not come in here. Jerusalem's it does have the advantage of being a walled city built on a hill. Not the easiest thing to conquer. Nevertheless, David took the stronghold of Zion, which is now the city of David. David said on that day, "Whoever would strike down the Jebusites, let him get up the water shaft to attack the lame and the blind, those whom David hates. Therefore it is said, the blind and the lame shall not come into the house." David occupied the stronghold and named it the city of David. David built the city all around from the Millo inward. And David became greater and greater, for the Lord, the God of hosts, was with him. So it is at that point that David finally comes along, conquers the city, and it will from here on be not just a Jewish city, but will be the capital city, right? It becomes the city of David. That's the city that David will establish as the capital of Israel. It becomes a capital city. So, not built by Israelites, conquered by Israelites, not a part of the original conquest of the Promised Land, but later under King David. So there's our history of Jerusalem before Israel. Jerusalem as the capital city. David makes Jerusalem his capital city. It is his son Solomon who builds the whole thing up. I'm not going to have you read all of 1 Kings 6 through 9 because it's significant. But if you want to read, like, there is intricate detail about the temples being constructed, the palaces being constructed, the Hall of Justice, the Palace of the Forest of Lebanon. Like, they go into pretty good detail on that. But it is Solomon who really builds up Israel into this sort of stronghold city.
Jerusalem.
What did I say?
Israel.
Yeah, Jerusalem. Also built up Israel. Israel is at its height in power So not just Jerusalem, all of you think of the architecture. So Solomon builds walls, builds the temple, and builds the great palace for himself there. But it's not just Jerusalem that Solomon built up, but it is Israel itself. Israel will reach the height of its power under Solomon. But Solomon is the last king of united Israel. After Solomon dies, his son Rehoboam takes over. And Rehoboam, so Solomon, in order to accomplish this, taxes and works the people pretty hard. Solomon wants to build a great temple, wants to build a great palace, wants to build the walls up even further. And in order to do all the things he does that makes Israel so powerful during his reign, he taxes the people of Israel pretty hard, and he works the people pretty hard. The slaves and the servants working quite hard. Once Solomon dies, well, we're just going to read the story, because I think it's hilarious. 1 Kings 12. So right after you have 1 and 2 Samuel, you have 1 and 2 Kings. Okay. And the easy way to remember that is because Samuel is the prophet who anoints the first king. Right? Samuel anoints Saul. Right? You have the judges, and then because that's who rules Israel initially is the judges. They're just different leaders, but they don't hold any official title. They're just respected by the people. People want a king, so Samuel's the one who anoints it. So you have Samuel, then you have kings. Rehoboam went to Shechem, for all Israel had come to Shechem to make him king. When Jeroboam, son of Nebat, heard of it, for he was still in Egypt, where he had fled from King Solomon. So Jeroboam kind of pushed back on Solomon a little bit. Fled to Egypt. Jeroboam returned from Egypt, and they sent and called him. And Jeroboam and all the assembly of Israel came and said to Rehoboam, "Your father made our yoke heavy. Now therefore lighten the hard service of your father and his heavy yoke that he placed on us, and we will serve you." He said to them, "Go away for 3 days, then come again to me." So the people went away. So they were taxed heavily to do all the stuff that Solomon wanted to do. They're like, "Hey, now that all the stuff's built, give us a break, why don't you?" That's their proposal. Give us a break and we will serve you faithfully and loyally. Then King Rehoboam took counsel with the older men who had attended his father Solomon while he was still alive, saying, "How do you advise me to answer this people?" They answered him, "If you will be a servant to this people today and serve them and speak good words to them when you answer them, then they will be your servants forever." So there's some wise counsel from the older counselors who served Solomon, right? Serve them. Be good to your people, they'll be good to you. Offer to lighten that yoke, and they'll serve you faithfully. But he disregarded the advice that the older men gave him and consulted with the young men who had grown up with him and who now attended him. The party boys who grew up with the young prince, never having any responsibilities. Let's see what they have to say. He said to them, "What do you advise that we answer this people who have said to me, 'Lighten the yoke that your father put on us'?" The young men who had grown up with him said to him, "Thus you should say to this people who spoke to you, 'Your father made our yoke heavy, but you must lighten it for us.' Thus you should say to them, 'My little finger is thicker than my father's loins. Now, whereas my father laid on you a heavy yoke, I will add to your yoke. My father disciplined you with whips, but I will discipline you with scorpions.'" It is a good rule of thumb that any time the ruler of a country has to bring the size of his genitalia into it, no good is going to come of this decision, right? My little finger is thicker than my father's loins. Real mature, dude. Real mature. Totally showing that you're ready to lead this country. So Jeroboam and all the people came to Rehoboam on the third day, as the king had said, "Come to me again on the third day." And the king answered the people harshly. He disregarded the advice that the older men had given him and spoke to them according to the advice of the young men. "My father made your yoke heavy, but I will add to your yoke. My father disciplined you with whips, but I will discipline you with scorpions." So the king did not listen to the people, because it was a turn of affairs brought about by the Lord, that he might fulfill his word, which the Lord had spoken by Ajlah the Shilonite to Jeroboam son of Nebat. When all Israel saw that the king would not listen to him, the people answered the king, "What shall we do? What share do we have in David? We have no inheritance in the son of Jesse. To your tents, O Israel. Look now to your own house, O David." So Israel went away to their tents. And so tents in this case being their tribes. And the tribes are going to break up, and a couple will stay with the northern kingdom, which is now ruled by Rehoboam and will be called Israel. And the rest are going to go to the southern kingdom, which will be called Judah. And eventually Samaria is going to be made the capital of that northern kingdom. And that's where we get our Samaritans, because the northern kingdom is going to be conquered by the Assyrians, and they are going to intermarry with the Assyrians to create this new race of people that will be called the Samaritans by the time of Jesus. But as far as our Bible study of Jerusalem is concerned, the northern kingdom no longer matters to Jerusalem, because Jerusalem is the capital of the southern kingdom of Judah, the place where the rebels go, where the 10 tribes that said, "All right, well, if you're not going to make our life any easier, I don't see why we should bother being your subjects anymore." So 2 tribes stayed north, eventually become the Samaritans. 10 tribes south, kingdom of Judah, which Jerusalem remains the capital of, which Jeroboam is going to end up being the ruler of. So there's Jerusalem, capital of southern kingdom. All right. Starting to get into this whole, the spiritual is the historical is the spiritual thing. The big reason, one of the big reasons why Jerusalem is so significant is because Jerusalem is the site of the temple that was built by Solomon. But it's important for us to understand that the people of Israel believed that God physically inhabited the temple. That's sort of an odd thing for us to wrap our minds around today, because I think as Christians we have a much easier time envisioning God as this sort of spiritual being that is everywhere and nowhere, right? Like surrounds the universe, binds the universe, is within the universe, but is not isolated to a specific spot in the universe, right? Insofar as we picture God in the universe, we tend to picture God throughout the universe, right? Everywhere. But as I've written here, in the ancient Jewish understanding, God had a zip code. and that zip code was Jerusalem, was the temple in Jerusalem. You know, I mean, obviously, this is an exaggeration. You didn't actually send mail to God in Jerusalem. But in the same sense that you could send mail to me at my house, you could send mail to God in Jerusalem. God physically inhabits the temple in Jerusalem. And just to kind of give you some idea of that, we're going to go back a couple pages to 1 Kings 6. (11 through 13). So this is just as the temple is being built by Solomon. 6:1 through 13. Now the word of the Lord came to Solomon concerning this house that you are building. If you walk in my statutes, obey my ordinances, and keep all my commandments by walking in them, then I will establish my promise with you which I made to your father David. I will dwell among the children of Israel, and I will not forsake my people Israel. I will dwell among the children of Israel. God is making his house in Jerusalem with the people. If we go to 1 Kings 8, 10 through 11, this is as the, and so if you keep reading there in 1 Kings 6, where you'll get all the details of the temple being built, right? All the wood and all the measurements and all the stones and all the jewels and all the gold and all like it and all the cloth and like it gives you quite a lot of detail. If you wanted to recreate the temple, it would not be a hard thing to do, at least in terms of the directions. It would be a very difficult thing to do in terms of the size and the scale of it. It's not something, but you get pretty detailed directions. So as we go up to 1 Kings 8, 10 through 11. So this will give you a sense of the physics. So now we have completed the building of the temple, and we are in the process of getting the temple dedicated. This will also be where you'll find Solomon's prayer dedicating the temple. But the temple is now complete. And the Ark of the Covenant has been moved into the temple, into the Holy of Holies, into that deep inner sanctum. You remember when we talked about from Revelations that like only the priest could go, and only on like the special holy day to light the incense. Like, I mean, it's like it is not a place you are like for everybody. And the Ark of the Covenant has been taken and placed in there, and it's verse 10 says, "And when the priests came out of the holy place," so they have just dropped off the Ark of the Covenant, just dropped it off. "And as they are coming out of that room where they had left it, and when the priests came out of the holy place, a cloud filled the house of the Lord, so that the priests could not stand to minister because of the cloud, for the glory of the Lord filled the house of the Lord." So there is like this physical presence that is visible, that is palpable to the priest, to the point that they just have to get out of there because it's too much for them. And then again, 1 Kings 9:3, just to really drive this point home. "The Lord said to him, I have heard your prayer and your plea which you have made before me. I have consecrated this house that you have built and put my name there forever. My eyes and my heart will be there for all time." My eyes and my heart will be there for all time. So again, it's kind of, we tend to think of God in this very universal way, but for the Jewish people, God is in the temple. God is looking out from the temple, right? If God's eyes are in the temple, then God's point of view of the world is centered on that temple, right? It is extremely religiously significant. I don't know how else to better convey like the degree to which this matters to the Jewish people. God is there. Questions?
Even now.
Well, that's a really good question. We're gonna get there. So let's do this thing. We've got Jerusalem, originally not built by the Jewish people, conquered by David, becomes the capital of the Jewish people, site of the temple. That's where we're at so far in the history of this place. Up next, Jerusalem is conquered. Babylon shows up in 597 BCE, captures the king Jehoiachin, and takes him and his household off into captivity, and turns his uncle into the king. Because this guy rebels against Babylon. And they're like, all right, we're not going to have that. You're going to come and be our captive. The uncle rebels against Babylon. How are they related? I can't remember who takes over after, how Zedekiah's next king is related to Zedekiah, but the point is that several kings rebel against Babylon. And Babylon shows up once and in 597 takes the city, takes the king captive, installs a new king that thinks is going to be more subservient. And we can read this here real quick. 2 Kings 24. So this is the first time that the Nebuchadnezzar shows up. Where did I say to start? 8. Jehoiachin was 18 years old when he began to reign. He reigned 3 months in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Nehushta, daughter of Elanath of Jerusalem. He did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, just as his father had done. This is an important point of the theology that's going to develop, right, is that the kings are not behaving themselves, are being wicked, and that is why God is going to let them be conquered. At that time, the servants of King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon came up to Jerusalem, and the city was besieged. King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon came to the city while his servants were besieging it. King Jehoiachin of Judah gave himself up to the king of Babylon, himself, his mother, his servants, his officers, his palace officials. The king of Babylon took him prisoner in the 8th year of his reign. He carried off all the treasures of the house of the Lord and the treasures of the king's house. He cut in pieces all the vessels of gold in the temple of the Lord, which King Solomon of Israel had made. All this was as the Lord had foretold. He carried away all Jerusalem, all the officials, all the warriors, 10,000 captives, all the artisans and the smiths. No one remained except the poorest people of the land. So, first kings rise up. Jumping to verse 17, the king of Babylon made Mattaniah, Jehoiachin's uncle, king in his place and changed his name to Zedekiah. So, they're not going to pay their taxes to Babylon. Babylon shows up, it's like, you're not going to pay your taxes, we're just going to take you captive, we're going to take all your stuff. So they take out like a whole bunch of captives, a whole bunch of gold, basically conquer the city, put Zedekiah in his place because Zedekiah is supposed to be I'm trying to remember how Jehoiakim is. Well, anyway, Zedekiah, they keep rebelling. They keep refusing to pay taxes. Nebuchadnezzar comes back in 586 BCE, and this time isn't playing around. Right? He's like, I already came once and took you captive, and
Says here he was Josiah's third son.
oh, okay.
And that made him the uncle.
Yeah. So, Nebuchadnezzar comes back after they once again rebel. After Jehoiachin has already been taken captive and all of his court has been taken captive and a whole bunch of gold is taken off, they still rebel again. And this time when Babylon comes back, they are not messing around. And instead of just taking some captives and taking some gold, they lay waste to the city. They tear the wall. Well, we'll just read it. We'll read it. Jeremiah 52, 1 through 16. So they already got their wrist slapping, right? They had a king taken prisoner in his court and his family. But when they rebel again, Zedekiah is now going to rebel. Apparently he did not learn the lesson. So, Jeremiah 52, yep. Zedekiah was 21 years old when he began to reign. He reigned 11 years in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Hamutal, daughter of Jeremiah of Libnah. He did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, just as Jehoiakim had done. Indeed, Jerusalem and Judah so angered the Lord that he expelled them from his presence. Zedekiah rebelled against the king of Babylon. That same king who had just conquered the previous king and installed him in his place, right? Apparently not a quick learner, this one. And in the 9th year of his reign, in the 10th month, on the 10th day of the month, King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon came with all his army against Jerusalem. This is like, have y'all seen the 300? No? Like, massive army type of situation, right? The first time it said it was Nebuchadnezzar's servants, right? The first time there was a rebellion, Nebuchadnezzar just called up some of the other neighboring countries that he had also conquered and was like, hey, I'll give you a break on your taxes for the next few years if you just go and beat up Jerusalem for me. And they did, right? They successfully beat up Jerusalem. They took the king captive. They took the gold. But Zedekiah has not learned the lesson and once again rebels just a short time later. And so Babylon is mad, and Babylon brings the full force. Like, you don't get to rebel twice in the span of a decade. We've got to make an example of you, right? So Nebuchadnezzar is going to make an example of them. King Nebuchadnezzar brings his whole army against Jerusalem, and they laid siege to it. So the city was besieged until the 11th year of King Zedekiah. On the 9th day of the 4th month, the famine became so severe in the city that there was no food for the people of the land. Then a breach was made in the city wall, and all the soldiers fled and went out from the city by night by the way of the gate between the two walls, by the king's garden, though the Chaldeans, which is another word for Babylonians, were all around the city. They went in the direction of Arabah. But the army of the Chaldeans pursued the king and overtook Zedekiah in the plains of Jericho, and all his army was scattered, deserting him. Then they captured the king and brought him to the king of Babylon at Riblah in the land of Hamath, and passed sentence on him. The king of Babylon killed the sons of Zedekiah before his eyes, and also killed all the officers of Judah at Riblah. He put out the eyes of Zedekiah and bound him in fetters. And the king of Babylon took him to Babylon and put him in prison until the day of his death. The last thing that he got to see was all of his family killed, and then his eyes were put out, so that would be the last thing he saw. And then he would spend the rest of his days in prison. In the 5th month, on the 10th day of the month, which was the 19th year of King Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, Nebuzaradan, the captain of the bodyguard who served the king of Babylon, entered Jerusalem. He burned the house of the Lord, the king's house, and all the houses of Jerusalem. Every great house he burned down. All the army of the Chaldeans who were with the captain of the guard broke down all the walls around Jerusalem. So, everything is toasted. The temple is destroyed, the palace is destroyed, the walls are torn down. There is no longer an option to rebel, right? There's no longer a wall around the city. If you rebel, then just get a march right in now. It is just total destruction of Jerusalem. They are made an example of. The city is laid waste. This leads to some serious theological problems for the Jewish people, but also some pretty serious theological advancement. Because first, keep in mind, this is the physical dwelling of God, and some mortals were able to take it down. How do we interpret that? What is that? How do we handle that? So this starts to get to your question, Joe, of is God still there physically in that space? The attitude about that question starts to shift. So one of the things that's important to keep in mind is this is actually the real switch for the Jewish people to monotheism, where they actually become real monotheists. Before this, they are henotheists. And henotheism is a word that we don't encounter very often because there aren't many henotheistic faiths. But the premise of henotheism is that there's one God alone who you are supposed to worship, but that doesn't mean that there aren't other gods. The Jewish people, up until this point, recognized the gods of their neighbors as being gods that exist. They just thought that their God was the greater God, the more important God, the one that they alone should worship, right? Yahweh, the God of Israel, the God of the Jewish people, that's the supreme best God. But that doesn't mean that the gods of the Canaanites and the Jebusites and the Egyptians and the Babylonians and right, like those gods, as far as the Jewish people were concerned, existed. They just weren't as good as these people's gods. After the conquest, Israel has to figure out what happened. How is this possible? How is it that mere mortals destroyed the house of our God? And more to the point, does this mean that the gods of Babylon are stronger than our God? Right? Because, right, that whole duality thing, right? There's a heavenly plane and an earthly plane, and things are going on in the heavenly plane that mirror the earthly plane. As the armies of Israel and Babylon are attacking, their understanding was that meant up in heaven, the spiritual armies of God were fighting the spiritual armies of the Babylonians' gods. And when they stop and think about what happened here, how is it possible that mortals destroyed our city, our temple, destroyed the dwelling place of our God? This is what they come up with. No. The Babylonian gods are not stronger than our gods. It turns out there are no other gods. Our God is the only God who exists. Our God is the God of all people everywhere, throughout the world. Our God created the whole world. There is only one God. Period. Full stop. Our God abandoned us and let us be conquered because we had turned our backs on our God. Because all these prophets kept coming and telling us that if we didn't stop worshiping idols and we didn't start caring for the poor, I think we've covered this before, right? Those are the two big no-nos that the prophets will harp on kings about all day long. You have to worship no other gods but our God, right? Henotheism, even before it was monotheism, it was, there is only one God that you're supposed to worship and adore, and that's our God. And you are supposed to care for the poor and the powerless of the kingdom, because nobody else has the power. They don't have the power to protect themselves. So you as the ruler are supposed to do this. The rulers ignored those two things, and so they said, what happened was God chose to let the city of Jerusalem fall. God did not intervene on their behalf because they had abandoned God. This, by the way, was not a God totally abandoning them. This was more of a 40 years in the wilderness type scenario, right? God's covenant, we are told, that's nothing. Yeah, we are told in the writings of the prophets, does not abandon them permanently, but has let them be chastised. But the covenant still stands. They're still God's chosen people. And even though God is letting them be conquered, God is going to bring them back. This is also the time in history where we get the development of the synagogues, where there are alternate places to go for the worship of God. The temple, even after this, is going to continue to be especially significant, and the place where certain sacrifices and certain acts of worship have to be made, but it is no longer the exclusive place where, it becomes a lot less exclusive. I guess there were a couple other holy sites besides the temple, Bethel and such. But so this is when the synagogues start to pop up, when Jewish cities have. This is also the time where we get a strong emphasis on the purity laws. on the importance of observing the Sabbath to the degree that it's like, you do not work at all on the Sabbath. The purity laws around circumcision. A lot of what we read up until this point in the Old Testament, this is that whole editing thing, was retroactively written back into stories to show how important this becomes. The Sabbath keeping, the circumcision, the dietary laws, right? All those things that we find in Leviticus were probably not actually things that Moses made such a big deal of. Most of those things come from the time of the Babylonian captivity, as a way for the Jewish people in the 70 years that they are in Babylonian captivity to maintain their distinct ethnic and religious identity. So they don't just basically become Babylonians while they're living in Babylon, so that they don't adopt the customs of the Babylonians. All of these holiness codes, these purity laws become extremely, extremely important at this point. So, this is, like I said, starting to get to this whole spiritual is historical, is spiritual is historical, right? There is a clear historical event that occurs at a point in history, and this, by the way, is attested to outside of biblical sources. There's Nebuchadnezzar or somebody writing on his behalf kind of boasted about that. Like there's I can't remember what it's called now, they've designated it, but this very ancient clay tablet that has detailed much of this story from Nebuchadnezzar's point of view, of coming and conquering. So this is a very specific event that occurs in history, but it has tremendous implications for the religious and spiritual understandings and practices of the Jewish people. Right? This is really the catalyst for the advent of monotheism in our world. There's really not such a thing as monotheism properly before this. The idea that there is only one God who has created the whole world, who is God of the whole world and all people in it. So, major thing. Like I alluded to earlier, the prophets, even as they are starting to do their I told you so, they warned the kings, you need to stop your evil ways or you're going to be conquered. And with the conquest imminent, the prophets make it really clear that this does not represent an abandoning of these people by God, but a chastising. Right? Just like the 40 years in the wilderness to cleanse out some of the sinful people, this is an opportunity for the Jewish people to recommit themselves to God. And they do. And 70 years later, we are going to have the restoration of Jerusalem. Persia comes along and conquers Babylon and frees the people of Israel. I'm only going to read the first one. Ezra 1's kind of long, but it's actually a really cool read. And it's another one of those places where we have historical confirmation of at least most of what's in Ezra 1. There is something called the Cyrus cylinder, which is this, again, very ancient clay artifact that had the decree of Cyrus written on this clay cylinder, and it matches up some pieces of it almost word for word what's in Ezra 1. So it is worth pointing out that even as there are embellishments and straight up mythologies in the Bible, there's also quite a lot of history here, right? That we can that has independent verifications, other ancient artifacts that still exist that were, like I said, the conquest, there's a clay tablet about the story from Nebuchadnezzar's point of view. In Ezra 1, you're going to find the decree of Cyrus. But I'm going to read the Isaiah 45, 1-7, mostly because I feel like at some point, in some Bible study we talked about how the word Messiah is used in more than one place in the Bible. Have we talked about that? How Messiah is like, there are Messiahs, little m, and then there's a capital M Messiah that for Christians is Jesus, you know, like this great. So I wanted to read this one in particular. So Isaiah 45. Thus says the Lord to his anointed, to Cyrus. Remember, Messiah is just the Hebrew word that means anointed. It's literally, if we were to, this has been translated as anointed because from a Christian perspective, we only generally refer to Jesus as the Messiah. But if we were reading this in Hebrew, it would be quite clear. Thus says the Lord to his Messiah, to Cyrus, whose right hand I have grasped, to subdue nations before him and strip kings of their robe, to open doors before him and gates shall not be closed. I will go before you and level the mountains. I will break in pieces the doors of bronze and cut through bars of iron. I will give you the treasures of darkness and riches hidden in secret places, so that you may know that it is I, the Lord, the God of Israel, who call you by your name. For the sake of my servant Jacob and Israel, my chosen, I call you by name, I surname you, though you do not know me. I am the Lord, and there is no other beside me, there is no God. I arm you, though you do not know me, so that you may know from the rising of the sun and from the west that there is no one beside me. I am the Lord, there is no other. I form light and create darkness. I make weal and create woe. I, the Lord, do all these things. So this is really significant, one, because this is our Cyrus the Great is the name of the dude who is the emperor of Persia. He is going to come and conquer Babylon. And at the time that he conquers Babylon, he allows all those Jews who were captive in Babylon, remember that was what Nebuchadnezzar had done, is he took a whole bunch of people captive to make sure that there would be no more rebellion. When Cyrus the Great of Persia conquers Babylon, he lets all of those people go free. And they return back to Jerusalem and they start the process of rebuilding their country and rebuilding their city. There's more details about that in Ezra 1, but I wanted to focus on this one before we run out. We won't have time for Ezra 1, but I wanted to focus on this one for two reasons. One, it covers that thing that we were talking about before, right? The word Messiah literally just means anointed, and it shows up many times in the Bible. So there's like Messiahs, lowercase m, that are just people who are anointed by God, and Messiah, capital M, which we use to refer to Jesus as especially anointed by God for a special and unique role, right? But the other reason I wanted to focus on this is because this really gives you a sense of that sort of development of theology here, right? All of a sudden, instead of henotheism, we have monotheism. We have the God of Israel speaking, right? Yahweh, the God, the Lord God, saying, I will guide you, Cyrus. I am going to give you the power to conquer Babylon in order to set my people free. And even though you don't know me, I am the one who is guiding your hand. I am the one who is empowering you. I am the one who is making your conquest possible. I am giving you the ability to do this. And also you have this very clear, right, like, I am the Lord and there is no other. Besides me, there is no God. So you kind of get all of these elements that we've talked about, right? So Cyrus comes along, conquers Babylon. The people of Israel are able to return back to Jerusalem, back to their country. Following that, they are going to rededicate the temple. We have this great little story.
So Cyrus was commissioned by God to rebuild the temple. The temple rebuilt with his money.
Right. And that's, I mean, if you look at Ezra, much of the temple's treasures are restored to the people. So Cyrus is actually like a really kind of sly dude. Cyrus is one of the people who really does a great job of So long as you be good to them, they'll be good to you, right? So we talked about, when we were doing Revelations, this idea of tribute and homage, where kings would come and conquer nations and say, you can stay the king of your country, you just need to pay me taxes. Cyrus does that and does that really well. Like Cyrus has some basic laws that sort of govern his whole empire, but then really leaves people free to do their own thing and interferes in lives pretty minimally in an effort to keep the taxes coming to him. I mean, right here, right, he's called the Lord's anointed. He empowered the people of Jerusalem to rebuild their city and to rebuild their temple. They're not going to rebel against him. Never. So he's a pretty sly dude. So he doesn't actually rebuild anything, but he sets all the people free, and he even gives them some startup money to do that. He said, lets the people of Jerusalem go back home, and he even gives them some startup money to rebuild their city with. Start rebuilding some walls, start rebuilding some palaces, start rebuilding some temple. Excuse me, it is not going to get to Solomon level glory for a while, but they start rebuilding. Well, we're running out of time.
I hate to say we got ethical.
Okay, temple's going to be rededicated. There's this great passage in Nehemiah that is about them rededicating the temple. And as they're rebuilding the temple, they find one of these old books of the law, these old books of Moses that had just been lost to them, and read from that, and everybody's like, God is so good, because now we have not just rebuilt our temple, but while we were cleaning up the wreckage of the temple, we found books of the Bible we had completely forgotten we had. God is good, yay God. Eventually, Herod the Great is going to complete the restoration of Jerusalem and get it back up looking spick and span. That's why he's Herod the Great, is because he rebuilds the temple, builds even bigger palaces, builds walls, does all the things. Jerusalem is super significant for Jesus for a whole lot of reasons. But because mainly as the capital city, this is where Jesus is going to go to fulfill his ministry. Luke 9:51 is that passage where it says he set his face to go to Jerusalem. Does that ring a bell? Mm-hmm. If you ever read the Gospel of Luke, you might want to make a note of this. If you ever want to read the Gospel of Luke as a gospel, Luke 9:51, he set his face to go to Jerusalem, is the turning point of the gospel. Up until that point, it's build up of disciples, getting the teaching down, and it's at Luke 9:51 when it says he set his face to go to Jerusalem that things get real. It's a really significant passage in the Gospel of Luke. It's sort of like the event in the story where the villain has revealed himself for the first time, or the point in the story where, the plot thickens, I guess is right. That's the phrase, the plot thickens. That's the point where the whole mood and tone of Luke's gospel shifts. So he sets his face to go to Jerusalem. Luke 13:33-34 is the passage where he basically says, it is impossible for a prophet to be killed outside of Jerusalem, because he is now heading towards Jerusalem and he understands what's going to happen to him there. But he talks about the significance of that. That's where he goes for the triumphal entry. You all know this, the story of Palm Sunday, right? Riding on the donkeys, the palm branches, the Hosanna, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. I wanted to read, that's the story of it's at the end of that Luke 19, I think. There was one that I didn't want to skip. I gotta get to New Testament. At the end of Luke 19. So Luke 19 is also the story of the triumphal entry, but at the very end of it, I'm not going to read the whole thing, but starting in verse 41. As Jesus came near and saw the city, he wept over it, saying, if you, even you, had only recognized on this day the things that make for peace, but now they are hidden from your eyes. Indeed, the days will come upon you when your enemies will set ramparts around you and surround you and hem you in on every side. They will crush you to the ground, you and your children within you, and they will not leave within you one stone upon another, because you did not recognize the time of your visitation from God. So not only does he do all of these sort of last of life activities, right? This is the capital, so this is where his ministry, if it's going to be a public thing, needs to happen. Right? That's why he's coming to Jerusalem, triumphal entry, money changers, driven from temple, Last Supper, arrest, trial, crucifixion, right? Resurrection, all those things. All those things are happening in Jerusalem because that's the capital and that's the public space for him to declare his ministry. But he's also calling it the city that kills the prophets, saying it's impossible for a prophet to die outside of Jerusalem. And when he comes, he predicts the second fall of the city of Jerusalem, saying it's not going to be long before you are surrounded. And that will happen. In 70 AD, Rome is going to do basically what Babylon did. They're going to lose their patience after like a series of small insurrections, and they're just going to come back and be like, and just totally wipe the city. Interesting side note, Golgotha, the stone quarry where Jesus is crucified, is the site of the stone quarry that Solomon used to build the walls, the temple, and his palace. Just an interesting little tidbit for you there.
The Wailing Wall is the wall of the temple, right?
Yes. The Wailing Wall is what little stands of the temple. Man, we have just run out of time. There's a whole lot of symbolism stuff there. I will let you look it up. They use Jerusalem in several different ways in each one of those passages. The Revelations one you'll remember, right? The New Jerusalem coming down from heaven. Galatians and Hebrews each use Jerusalem metaphorically and in different ways. In Galatians, Paul is even really explicit about, like, here's a metaphor for you about Jerusalem. So it's important to note that it is symbolic. I do want to point out this last bullet point. Sometimes it's both a symbol and not a symbol. So there are passages, especially among the Old Testament prophets, where the Old Testament prophets are very clearly referring to Jerusalem, the historic city in the historic context in which they are writing, but which later Christians come along and see that and interpret that to be a prophecy about Jesus, or about the return of Jesus, or about something that is significant to the Christian faith. And I don't think that there's anything wrong with that. It's just good to be aware that sometimes it's both. Sort of in the same way that we talked about how, like, Rome, how Babylon in the book of Revelations was used symbolically to refer to Rome. But we could also, talk like, the stories of the Bible are true because they continue to happen, right? So just because a prophet was writing about a specific, like I'm thinking about the one that we always hear during Advent, about a branch a shoot will come forth from the stump of Jesse, right? Like, and that's, in Advent, we read that to talk about Jesus. It wasn't intended to be about Jesus when it was first written, but there's nothing wrong with the Christian people looking back at their holy text, which include the Older Testament, and seeing Jesus there and reinterpreting it in their circumstances today in just exactly the same way that you and I read the Bible and reinterpret it in our circumstances today. So sometimes Jerusalem is both a symbol and not a symbol in the same passage.
But essentially, we still have a dog in the fight today.
And so I really wanted to jump to this last part because I think this is probably the most interesting thing about Jerusalem, right? So there's sort of your quick history of Jerusalem in the Bible. We didn't get time to read every single passage, and you can read those passages if you want to. But Jerusalem today continues to be a highly significant site for all three of the Abrahamic faiths, for Jews, for Christians, and for Muslims. And because of its incredible historic and religious significance, it continues to be a site of much violence today. And that's not new, right? I mean, the Crusades, and it's sort of a long-standing thing. So just a quick little touch on this. We've covered much of why Jerusalem is significant for the Jewish people, right? It was the capital of their nation. It was a site that was sacred to them historically, promised by God, in which the presence of God was uniquely there, right, within the temple. And there is this rich history, especially a history of being oppressed and then being saved. So we talked specifically about the Babylonian conquest, right? Babylon comes in, destroys Jerusalem, but later God rescues them from their captivity and lets them return home thanks to Cyrus. That history plays itself out again and again for the Jewish people, right? There's the Maccabean revolt that you'll find in the Apocrypha. There's the destruction of the city by the Romans. There's the Holocaust, right? All of this, right? The history is the symbolism, is the history, is the symbolism. This is a site at which the Jewish people suffered, and yet God kept bringing them back to and restoring them to. So when you think about the significance of it today, post-Holocaust, it is not at all hard to read the Babylonian narrative of the Older Testament right into that narrative again, right? It is a site where they have suffered but also been restored.
So is there absolutely, I can't say absolutely God's involved in it, but there's no, I can't see a path to peace in that place. I mean, the Palestinians claim that they're never going to get it back. Not, I can't say never, but I mean, there doesn't seem to be any justice right now. I mean, I don't know.
Sure.
Maybe I don't know what I'm saying.
Well, I do get what you're saying. Like, right, it is a messy situation. It is no small irony that the city, whose name literally means City of Peace, has been the site of so many battles, so many massacres, so much oppression, so much injustice, so much violence, and so much of that continues in our day today. We also have the Christians. There's all the significance there because of Jesus's historical connection. Jesus's death and resurrection occurred in Jerusalem, in the area of Jerusalem. For dispensationalist Christians, that's the site where Jesus is going to return again. For those folks who take Revelations more to be a prediction of the future than things like that, that's where Jesus is going to return again. But for Muslims, the Dome of the Rock marks the place where Muhammad ascended into heaven. So in the Islamic faith, Muhammad doesn't die, Muhammad ascends into heaven. And that's the site where it happens. It is the original Qibla, which is the direction of prayer. They now pray facing Mecca, but for the first 16 years of Muhammad's ministry, whatever you want to call it, they prayed towards Jerusalem until he changed it. It is one of 3 sites that he instructed his followers to make a holy pilgrimage to. And you have to remember that each of the Abrahamic faiths understands itself to have built on its predecessors, right? So Christians understand themselves to be like everything that the Jewish people were and then some, right? That's why we still have the Old Testament in our Bible. So all of the reasons why it's significant for the Jews, it's significant for Christians. And Muslims consider themselves to be like the 3.0. Like they got the last revelation where the Jews got the first and the Christians got the second. They got the third. So for Muslims, Jerusalem is significant for all the reasons that it's significant to Jews and to Christians, right? Like Muslims also revere Jesus as a great prophet who who ascended into heaven. So for all of the reasons, right? So
Am I just misconstruing everything or missing the point? All three, we all believe in the same God,
yes,
essentially.
yes.
So we got.
I mean, there's some different dogmas, some different scriptures, some different traditions, some different practices, but yes,
Significant.
all of these three religions
Are fighting over the same God.
believe that they are worshiping the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the Lord God, Yahweh.
And for the Jews to rebuild the temple, they're gonna have to tear down the Dome of the Rock.
I think that this is, like I said, I'll be honest, that like this Bible study, I think it's good. It does give you sort of a basic history of Jerusalem, and Jerusalem obviously super significant site in the Bible. But I think the far more interesting conversations are around Jerusalem today. And how can we find peace in the city of peace? That's what the name of Jerusalem means, the city of peace. And it has been the site of conflict pretty much nonstop for the last 3,000 years.
And do they have 37 political parties?
I am not intimately familiar with the
And that's why they can't.
details of,
Yeah.
well, I mean, it's
Just spread out.
it's messy.
Yeah.
I think especially when you have an attitude, which this is not true of all Jews or even all Jews in Israel, but of some Jews in Israel, if you have an attitude that this land is your land because it is promised to you and ordained by God that it is your land, that makes it kind of hard to make a compromise with the people that are also there. It's a tiny little piece of land. It's not big for the amount of significance that it holds. It's a hard, when you look at so many other, I mean, you can look at like, the Eastern European countries as they broke up after the Soviet Union collapsed. Like, it's not hard to take a big country and be like, well, we're actually three distinct ethnicities with three distinct languages and three distinct practices, so we're just going to divide this country up between us. That's not a hard thing to do when you go to a decent-sized country. When you have this tiny little sliver of land that is so profoundly important to what collectively is about half the world's religious population, it's not an easy thing to get sorted out. Maybe if we get the chance over the summer, I have a friend who's a pastor in Minnesota who was the pastor. I got to know her when she was in Brookings. But she and her husband, he was an archaeologist and she was a missionary of the United Church of Christ, both in Israel and Jerusalem. And maybe I can see if we can't get the church to rent them a little cabin and they can take a little vacation out here. They can take a little vacation out here and then come do a Sunday service and just sort of talk about their experiences of what it's like living in Jerusalem in the modern era. But the short version is it is incredibly complex and it's very messy, and it is a tough situation. It is.
I think Peg Ryan, who just came back, or she's still there in Israel, and Mary, who lives with Tom Karna, she was there last fall, Israel. When we talked to her.
Well, and I do want, I'll throw this out as something that I do know from my friend's experience, which is that if you go on like one of those 1 week or 2 week Holy Land tours, you will not come anywhere close to getting the perspective of what's really going on. Because those things are pretty highly cultivated to keep you away from the political stuff and the suffering, especially of like Palestinian folks that are living in, behind barbed wire, razor wire walls and have no freedom of movement. And you don't get the whole, you definitely see the sunny side of things, and they tend to diminish the difficult side of things.
You were supposed to clean this all up.
But Emily, was I supposed to clean that all up?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, no, I'm sure I didn't know that, but now that you told me, I'm sure I can get Middle East peace solved in the next week or two. Let me get right on that, Joe.
We'll give you summer.
Yeah, right, I got a sabbatical, that should be more than enough time to solve the Middle East peace situation. No, I mean, it's that, right? It's, just like I said, so this may be total naivety, but I think that if there is a path for peace, it starts with just what you said, that at least in theory, we all worship the same God. We all claim Abraham as our ancestor in the faith, right? We all claim all of this history that I just laid out here. Jews, Christians, and Muslims would all
Buy into all of it.
buy into all of that. And so if there's a path for peace, I think somehow it involves starting with what we share in common. But at the same time, it cannot be ignored, and it is incredibly difficult to make people forget the centuries of violence and bloodshed that have taken place. I mean, that's a really difficult place for peace to,
Thanks, Dustin.
Yeah,
I like ending my Bible studies on cheerier notes.
Yeah.
I miss